two men standing shield to shield, not just as soldiers, but as lovers. Now imagine an entire army built on that bond. In the heart of ancient Greece, the sacred band of Thebes was unlike anything the world had ever seen. 150 pairs of male lovers trained to fight and die together. To their enemies, they seemed unstoppable. To their allies, they were both admired and feared. Their story challenges everything we think we know about love, loyalty, and the power that comes when the two are bound together on the battlefield. This wasn't a legend. It was a force so fierce it shattered Spartan supremacy and rewrote history itself. Comment: the time you're watching this, I love seeing when my history travelers arrive. And if discovering history's most hidden, forbidden truths excites you, subscribing is always your choice. But the next battles are even more shocking. You don't tiptoe into this tale, you're thrown straight into it. Imagine standing in a city where the fiercest warriors are not praised for being cold or detached, but for being bound together by love. Not the marble-carved ideals you hear sung by poets, but real, lived devotion between two men who would rather die than let each other fall. That's Thebes, a place where whispers in the marketplace hide the makings of an army, unlike anything the Greek world has seen. The streets of Thebes hum with daily life traders shouting over figs and amphory children darting past weaving looms, priests offering sacrifices that send curls of smoke into the air. But beneath the rhythm of routine, you catch another kind of murmur. They say there is a group being formed not from random recruits or paid mercenaries, but from pairs of lovers chosen precisely because their bond is unbreakable. To outsiders, it sounds laughable. To those within, it sounds revolutionary. Pause for a moment and think who fights with more fire. A man tasked with guarding a stranger beside him, or a man sworn heart and soul to the companion at his side? It isn't hard to answer. Affection, loyalty, and the raw instinct to protect someone dear can be sharper than any sword. You sense that the Thebans have understood something others have missed, that courage doesn't only grow in drills and punishments, but in the quiet certainty that failure means losing the one person you cannot bear to lose. Thebes itself is fertile ground for such a daring experiment. For generations, this city has lived in the shadow of its rivals. Athens basks in its philosophers and its theaters. Sparta boasts its endless discipline and legendary warriors. Thebes, it has known both humiliation and resilience, conquered and dismissed, yet never fully broken. In a city that has tasted defeat, the hunger for a new path burns strong. You can almost hear it in the clink of hammers at the forge, in the voices rising around the agora, the desire to finally claim a place on equal footing with Greece's giants. Names begin to surface. Leaders like Gorgidas, who dares to imagine that devotion can be forged into a weapon. He looks at the bonds of affection and sees not weakness, but steel. And once the idea takes root, it spreads quickly. It feels a little like watching a spark catch dry kindling. Soon no amount of mockery can smother it. Of course, ridicule comes easily. Travelers laugh over wine cups. Thebes builds its army out of couples. The Spartans scoff, certain that only boys whipped into hardness can hold a phalanx. Yet the laughter rings hollow once you notice the intensity in the eyes of these paired men. You see them in training yards, sweat gleaming hands, blistered every thrust of the spear, done not just for honor, but for the person who shares their tent, their bread, their life. If you want proof of how unusual this is, just look at other Greek practices. Most polies separated affection and battle keeping them in different corners of life. Thebes, in daring to merge them, creates a bond that no casual oath could rival. What outsiders call scandal, insiders begin to call strength. You drift closer to the Cadmia, the citadel, where so much power has shifted hands over centuries. The stones themselves seem to carry the weight of Thebes' longing. Here in the city that once betrayed and once resisted, there grows a belief that loyalty born from love can surpass even the iron grip of Spartan law. It's audacious, it's fragile, yet it has the potential to change everything. Think of it like this. In other cities, soldiers are drilled to fight for abstract ideals, glory, polis, or reputation. But here in Thebes, a man fights for someone whose hand he held by the riverbank, whose voice steadied him in the night, whose loss would be unbearable. That isn't an abstract idea. It's flesh and blood. And flesh and blood, when threatened, can make ordinary men do extraordinary things. The whispers keep spreading. Soon they are no longer whispers at all. They are shaping into a force that will step onto the battlefield with shields shining and resolve unshakable. What began as gossip in smoky corners of the Agora is about to echo across the Greek world. And standing here, you can already feel it, the ground trembling with the birth of something that will make even the Spartans think twice before they laugh again. You keep walking through Thebes, and the sense of restlessness grows with every step. The city feels like a man who has been underestimated too many times and is finally ready to show his hand. Stalls creak under piles of fruit potters call out over their spinning wheels, and herds of goats bleat their complaints as they're driven toward the gates. Daily life carries on, but behind the noise you can feel the weight of history pressing in. Thebes is no stranger to humiliation, and you can almost taste the bitterness that lingers in the air. This is a city that once allied with the Persians during the great invasions, a stain that left its reputation sullied in the eyes of other Greeks. Later, Thebes found itself bullied by Sparta, manipulated by Athens, always caught in the tug-of-war of greater powers. The walls around you may look strong, but you know that walls cannot protect a city forever. What really protects it is spirit, and for a long time, Thebes has been short of it. Yet now, something feels different. There's a quiet determination in the way the elders argue in the council chambers, a sharp edge in the laughter of the young men sparring in dusty courtyards. You remember how Athens claimed brilliance through philosophy and drama, and Sparta clung to its rigid military system. Thebes, lacking the prestige of Athens and the discipline of Sparta, has often been dismissed as provincial second-rate. But that dismissal is exactly what lights a fire here. When you're constantly told you are less you, either bow down or fight back, Thebes has chosen the latter, and you are standing right at the moment when that choice begins to take shape. Thebes' geography itself whispers defiance. Nestled in Boeotia, surrounded by fertile plains, the city feeds itself well unlike the harsher lands of Sparta. Farmers here don't scrape the earth for survival, they thrive. And with thriving comes a certain confidence. You can feel it in the fields stretching beyond the city walls, where harvests swell with abundance. A city that eats well, thinks well, and eventually fights well. As you move toward the training grounds, you notice how Theban leaders are rethinking what it means to build strength. They have seen the Spartan model boys torn from families beaten into submission, molded into warriors who fight because fear leaves them no choice. But here in a city, once mocked for being weak leaders, dare to ask a different question. What if loyalty born of choice, not coercion, made for stronger warriors? It is in these quiet trials that the seeds of the sacred band are being sown. Consider the irony. Sparta rules by intimidation, Athens by persuasion. But Thebes decides to experiment with devotion. A risk, yes, but one born of necessity. If you've ever watched someone backed into a corner, you know that necessity makes the most unlikely strategies suddenly appealing. Thebes doesn't have the luxury of sticking to tradition. It has to gamble. And that gamble will soon pay off in a way that shakes Greece to its core. You glance around and see young men with the kind of hunger that cannot be trained, it must be lived. These are not soldiers driven by abstract honor or blind obedience. They are sons of Thebes, eager to carve a story that will finally make others remember their city's name with respect. Their energy is infectious. Even as farmers carry baskets past, even as women haul water from wells, the air crackles with the knowledge that something is building. Here's the striking thing. While other cities cling to old systems, Thebes listens to its own scars. Defeat and dismissal have taught it lessons no textbook can. You can almost hear the city muttering under its breath. We tried following the others, and where did it get us? Maybe it's time we trust ourselves. That whisper grows, turning into a plan that pairs not just bodies, but souls. Not just soldiers, but lovers. By the time the sun dips behind Mount Cithaeron, casting long shadows across the city, you know one thing for certain. Thebes is done playing the role of the background character in Greece's story. The city that once bent its knee to Sparta is ready to rise, and its path forward will not look like anyone else's. That is the stage being set as the sacred band prepares to be born. You find yourself at the edge of the Theban training grounds, where the dust hangs thick in the evening air, and the rhythm of spears striking against shields sets your heartbeat in sync. This is where the whispers you heard in the marketplace take on flesh. You watch as pairs of men, seasoned fighters, and their younger companions step forward, chosen not only for strength, but for loyalty. They are not random recruits pulled from the lottery of war. They are carefully selected, hand-picked, because their devotion to one another is as visible as the muscles on their arms. The process feels deliberate, almost ritualistic. Elders and commanders walk among the ranks, eyes sharp, searching not only for physical ability, but for the kind of trust that doesn't waver under scrutiny. Imagine trying to fake that two men standing shoulder to shoulder, pretending to be bound in spirit when they are not. It would show instantly. Instead, you see subtle gestures that reveal the truth. A hand tightening briefly on a shoulder, a glance that carries reassurance, the kind of small signs no drill sergeant can teach. In other Greek cities, bonds between men existed, but rarely were they elevated to something so official, so openly tied to the machinery of war. Here in Thebes, the idea is not just tolerated but embraced. These pairs are told that their bond is their greatest weapon, and you can see the way their posture changes when they hear it. They are no longer just trainees. They are partners in a sacred experiment, a band of brothers and lovers rolled into one. Think of how athletes are scouted today. Coaches don't just look for speed or stamina. They search for chemistry, for players who can anticipate each other's moves, who share a rhythm that outmatches pure talent. That is what you're witnessing here, centuries earlier, not just the making of soldiers, but the making of pairs, whose unity gives them an edge beyond numbers. You hear stories of names already circulating. Pelopidas, for instance, who will one day lead with the kind of charisma that makes men follow without hesitation. His presence alone electrifies the field, his belief in the sacred band lending it legitimacy. Or Gorgidas, whose daring vision of such an army plants the seed in the first place. These are not faceless recruits. They are men with histories, ambitions, and a willingness to gamble everything on the idea that love and loyalty can outfight tradition. As the sun lowers, drills begin. Pairs move in tight formation, each thrust of the spear mirrored as though choreographed. You notice how mistakes are corrected, not with barked insults, but with quiet encouragement. One stumbles, the other steadies him. One falters, the other pushes him back into line. In a world where soldiers are usually treated as interchangeable, these two fight as if welded together. It's strange how natural it feels. At first glance, it looks unconventional. Why lean so heavily on personal bonds when entire cities are at stake? Yet the longer you watch, the more obvious it becomes. Fear isolates, but devotion unites. Where another soldier might run to save his skin, these pairs lock shields tighter, knowing that retreat would mean abandoning the very person who completes them. It's not strategy drawn from manuals. It's instinct sharpened into discipline. You wonder how outsiders might see this. Would an Athenian laugh? Would a Spartan sneer? Likely yes, but you also know this. When those same outsiders one day face these pairs on the battlefield, the laughter will die in their throats. Because mockery doesn't hold the line under a rain of arrows, and scorn doesn't keep you standing when spears crash into shields. Loyalty does. The training stretches into night torches flickering across the yard, throwing long shadows that make the pairs look larger than life. You sense that something extraordinary is forming here. It isn't just an army unit, it's a declaration, a living statement that Thebes refuses to follow old models. These chosen men are about to redefine courage, proving that the heart can be as lethal a weapon as the blade. By the time the drills end and the men disperse into the darkened streets, you know you've witnessed more than practice. You've seen the sacred band beginning to take shape, pair by pair, oath by oath, until rumor transforms into reality. You don't hear the clang of swords first, you hear the breath, heavy measured like waves hitting a shore. That's the sound of training in Thebes, where the chosen pairs now throw themselves into drills that look more like dances than combat. The detail that seizes your attention is this. This army isn't fueled just by discipline or necessity. It's powered by passion. A passion so fierce that even the Spartans with their rigid codes and endless drills will one day feel its edge. The air reeks of sweat and trampled dust as men circle each other with spears poised. You watch one pair move in perfect unison, a strike, a shield raised, a counter-thrust. It's so fluid you'd think they rehearsed it on a stage rather than in a yard. And in a sense, they have rehearsed in every shared glance, every whispered promise, every meal eaten together after long hours under the sun. This isn't just training the body. It's forging a rhythm between two lives until they move like one. Everywhere you look, pairs are driving themselves harder than ordinary soldiers might. One man pushes forward in the shield wall, and his partner matches him, refusing to let the line break. Where a typical recruit might give up here, you see teeth, clenched eyes locked, because quitting would mean letting down the person you love most. It's not an abstract oath to city or gods, it's personal. You wonder how far would you push yourself if the person beside you was not only your comrade, but also the heartbeat of your world. Drills turn brutal. Wooden spears slam into shields until splinters fly. Men collapse from exhaustion, only to be yanked back to their feet by their partners. In another army, such weakness might earn ridicule. Here, it earns determination. One stumble is both men's failure, and so both fight to rise again. You begin to notice that these small moments, hands clasping forearms, nods of encouragement, build a strength deeper than any whip crack could inspire. And then come the exercises in formation. Shields overlap, spears jut forward, and pairs lock themselves into ranks tighter than temple stones. The commanders walk the lines shouting corrections, but the truth is clear. These men hold their ground because they refuse to break faith with one another. To fight in the sacred band is to carry your beloved's life in your hands, and that weight makes every maneuver sharper, every stance firmer. It's tempting to compare this to the way modern athletes or musicians describe chemistry. You've heard of teammates who know where the other will be, without looking, or duos whose harmony comes from years of breathing the same rhythm. That's what you're witnessing now, except instead of scoring goals or playing songs, these pairs are preparing to carve their names into Greek battlefields. Among them, figures of history stand tall. Pelopidas, not yet the famed general, but already a man whose presence commands attention, trains with relentless focus. His charisma bleeds into those around him. His belief in the experiment makes others believe too. You can see why later men will follow him into war with unshakable loyalty. Standing near him, pairs spar harder, as if the intensity of his gaze adds weight to their strikes. There's an undeniable irony in watching this unfold. For centuries, Greek warfare prided itself on uniformity, the phalanx, as a wall of sameness, shields and spears indistinguishable. Yet here, Thebes injects individuality into the formation. Instead of faceless units, they're crafting pairs whose devotion personalizes the fight. In doing so, they don't weaken the phalanx. They strengthen it. Each man has more than duty to uphold, he has love. When the sun finally dips, leaving the yard in half darkness, you can almost feel the energy pulsing off the ground. These aren't the hollow chants of men beaten into line, nor the rehearsed slogans of a city desperate for glory. This is something messier, rawer, and far more dangerous men who know that every bruise today prepares them for the moment when their lives and their loves will be tested in battle, and they are determined not to fail. You wander into the agora the next morning, and it doesn't take long before you overhear it mockery. Thebes sends lovers to war, a merchant scoffs while balancing amphorae on his mule. A traveler from Corinth chuckles, shaking his head. They'll collapse the moment a Spartan growls. Even an Athenian visitor, with the smugness only Athenians seem to perfect, mutters something about philosophy gone mad. You almost laugh at the irony here. Are states that pride themselves on cleverness and courage, yet they cannot see the strength right in front of them. But beneath the laughter, there's unease. The same people who ridicule are also watching closely. They see these pairs in training yards, bruised but unbroken eyes fierce with devotion. It's one thing to joke at a symposium over diluted wine, but another to stand in front of a shield wall that won't give way, because its members would rather die than retreat. Even the sharpest tongue goes quiet when faced with results. It's not the first time innovation has been mocked. Think about the Athenians who once laughed at Themistocles' obsession with building a navy only to owe their survival at Salamis to his foresight. Or think of the Spartans who scorned light infantry until they discovered how much damage swift skirmishers could inflict. History has a way of punishing those who sneer too loudly at ideas they don't understand. And you can already sense that Thebes' experiment will be no different. Among ordinary citizens, the opinions split. Some whisper that this sacred band is an embarrassment, too strange, too unorthodox. Others, often quieter, murmur that maybe, just maybe, this is exactly what the city needs. You can see it in the way mothers glance at the training grounds as they carry water jars. Their sons may not be part of the band, but they understand that if it holds their city, might finally stand tall against Sparta's arrogance. Even rival leaders can't quite decide how to respond. Officially, they scoff. Unofficially, they pay attention. No general worth his salt ignores an enemy trying something new. If love and loyalty can be shaped into discipline, what happens when these men march in real battle? You picture the moment when a Spartan commander so sure of victory suddenly realizes the shield wall before him won't break, because it is held together not by fear, but by devotion. That realization must sting sharper than any spear. Of course, prejudice lingers. Greek society has always carried contradictions. Poets might sing of bonds between men as noble, yet soldiers, and statesmen sneer when such bonds become official policy. It's the classic hypocrisy: celebrate an idea in art, but scorn it when it threatens tradition. You've probably seen this pattern in your own time, people praising innovation in speeches while clinging to old methods in practice. It's human nature, across centuries, to resist what unsettles the familiar. And yet, walking past the gymnasia, you can't deny the evidence. You see pairs sparring longer than anyone else, refusing to yield, shouting encouragement that cuts through fatigue. Where other soldiers might crumble under insult, these men seem fueled by it. It's as if every sneer thrown their way becomes another weight added to the forge, making them harder, sharper, more unbreakable. You catch yourself wondering if this was exactly what Theban leaders counted on. Mockery keeps rivals complacent. Let them laugh. Let them underestimate. Meanwhile, the band grows stronger, hidden in plain sight. It's a clever trick: turn ridicule into camouflage, then reveal your true strength at the decisive moment. By evening, the laughter in the agora has faded into the usual hum of trade. The jokes are still there, but quieter, now edged with curiosity, and you realize something simple: prejudice can scoff at devotion, but it cannot erase results. The more the sacred band trains, the more its enemies will learn that mockery is a brittle weapon, one that shatters the moment bronze meets bronze. The sun rises over the Boeotian plain, and you hear it before you see it: the clatter of shields, the steady rhythm of marching feet striking the earth in unison. The sacred band is no longer just a rumor whispered in marketplaces, or a curiosity mocked by rivals. It's a formation, a heartbeat of Thebes that moves like one body. You fall into step with them, and the ground trembles beneath your sandals, as if the earth itself recognizes the birth of something extraordinary. Each pair keeps close shield edges overlapping so precisely that you could slide a coin between them without it falling. The air fills with the metallic rattle of spear points brushing bronze and the low hum of men chanting to keep pace. Unlike other armies, where soldiers sometimes trudge with hollow expressions. Here, you see faces sharpened with focus. They march not because they are commanded, but because they believe. You wonder, can you hear belief in the sound of boots hitting the road? Because right now, it feels undeniable. As the column snakes through the countryside, farmers look up from their fields, wiping sweat from their brows. Children dash to the roadside eyes, wide craning, to glimpse the strange army of lovers turned warriors. Some laugh, some gape in awe, but all fall silent when they feel the weight of that formation passing by. It isn't the noise of numbers, it's the stillness, the unspoken message that these men would not break, even if the sky itself collapsed. You can imagine the contrast to Sparta. Their boys are ripped from their families, hardened through cruelty, their loyalty beaten into them. Here in Thebes, men march bound by choice, by affection, freely given by loyalty that no lash could inspire. One might say the Spartans march to avoid shame. The sacred band marches to protect pride, the kind rooted in love. Which you think to yourself, would you rather face across a battlefield? At the front of the formation, commanders ride or stride with quiet authority. Pelopidas, whose charisma spreads through the ranks like fire, carries himself with calm assurance. His men don't just respect him, they trust him the way a pair in the band trusts one another. It's leadership by example, not intimidation, and it's contagious. You feel it ripple backward through the lines, each pair straightening each shield, lifting higher, because they know they are part of something larger than themselves. The march is not without hardship. Roads turn to dust, throats parch in the summer heat, sandals split on sharp stones. Yet where one falters, his partner steadies him. Where one stumbles, the other takes his arm, refusing to let the line waver. This is the advantage of pairing. You can see it with your own eyes. In another army, weakness spreads like rot. Here it's patched, instantly repaired by devotion before the damage spreads. Villages along the way offer breadwater, sometimes only silence. Some people are curious, others cautious, unsure if this experiment will protect them or embarrass them. But no one can ignore the sight. 250 pairs of men moving as one, their shadows stretching long across the plain, their spears glinting in the light. It's unforgettable. You sense that even those who doubt will retell this moment years later when the sacred band's reputation is sealed. The sound of marching becomes almost hypnotic. Step shield breath. Step shield breath. You close your eyes for a moment and let it wash over you, realizing that this rhythm is not only a practice of movement, but a declaration of intent. The sacred band is not training anymore. They are heading toward destiny. And destiny, as history will show, has a way of favoring those who march with conviction rather than fear. By the time they set camp under the fading light, smoke from cook fires curling into the sky, you know this much. Thebes has transformed whispers into a living force. Tomorrow, those marching feet will not only echo on dirt roads, but on the fields where empires rise and fall. You hear the clash before you see it, the metallic roar of bronze against bronze, the cries of men straining, and the thunder of hooves on dry earth. What strikes you instantly is this: for centuries the Spartans have stood as the terror of Greece, their phalanxes, an unbreakable wall of discipline. But at Leuctra in 371 BCE, you watch something unthinkable unfold. The sacred band of Thebes meets Sparta head-on, and the unshakable finally shatters. The battlefield stretches wide, the dust already thick from thousands of feet stomping in formation. Across the plain, Spartan ranks gleam under the sun, crimson cloaks draped over shoulders, shields polished to mirrors. They stand with the arrogance of men who have never truly lost, certain that this too will be another easy victory. You can almost hear their scoffs. Thebes. Thebes is nothing. But when you look back at the sacred band, you see no hesitation, only a resolve that runs deeper than tradition. The strategy itself is bold. Epaminondas, the Theban general, knows better than to fight Sparta on its own terms. Instead of a traditional line, he masses his troops deep on the left wing, concentrating force exactly where the Spartans expect domination. And at the very point of this wedge, he places the sacred band. 250 pairs of men, shield-to-shield spears bristling forward, carrying not just weapons, but the weight of every insult hurled at them, every sneer that dismissed their bond as weakness. The charge begins. You feel the ground quake as the Spartans advance, a red tide pressing forward with their usual machine-like confidence. But this time, the tide meets a wall that refuses to break. Shields crash together with a sound like thunder rolling across mountains. The Spartans push, expecting the line to buckle. Yet the sacred band holds. Men strain, sweat pouring, but their formation is locked tighter than stone. Each pair fights not only for survival, but for the man at his side. And that difference becomes the crack in Sparta's perfection. Then the push turns. Slowly, at first almost imperceptibly, the Spartans lose ground. You see disbelief flicker in their eyes. As the unthinkable happens, they are being driven back. The sacred band presses harder, every thrust of the spear carrying centuries of Theban humiliation transformed into fury. This is not just battle, it's vindication. Around you, the plain erupts into chaos. Horses scream, dust blinds, and bronze glints in every direction. But your focus keeps returning to that wedge, to the lovers of Thebes, who push forward step by step, shoulder to shoulder, refusing to yield. They are. When the Spartan king, Cleombrotus, falls in the melee, the shock ripples through the ranks. You can feel the momentum shift, like a storm changing direction. The once invincible Spartans stumble, their perfect machine, jammed by something they never prepared for, devotion stronger than fear. The Thebans surge, and suddenly the myth of Spartan invincibility collapses in dust and blood. As the field clears, you realize you are standing in the aftermath of a turning point. The bodies of Spartans lie where no Spartan army was supposed to fall. Thebes, once mocked as provincial, has dealt the most powerful state in Greece its first true defeat. And at the heart of it all lies the sacred band, their formation battered but unbroken, their victory sealing their place in legend. You can almost hear the silence spreading through Greece as word travels. If Sparta can be beaten, who cannot? If love and loyalty can outmatch fear and tradition, what else might change? Thebes has not just won a battle, it has rewritten the balance of power. And you, standing in the dust of Leuctra, know you have witnessed history, fracture and reform in the space of a single afternoon. The field at Leuctra still lingers in your mind, but the aftermath is even more striking. You walk through Thebes after the victory, and the city doesn't look humbled anymore. It glows. For the first time in generations, Thebans stride through their streets with their heads high, as if the dust of centuries has been shaken from their shoulders. What was once dismissed as an experiment, pairs of lovers turned into soldiers, has now become the pride of a city, and even rivals are forced to admit it. You hear poets already sharpening their words. Stories spread faster than wildfire in Greece, and the sacred band quickly becomes more than a unit, it becomes a symbol. Bards sing not only of their discipline, but of their devotion. Philosophers debate whether courage born of affection might in fact be the highest kind of courage. Even those who once mocked fall silent when faced with the undeniable fact Thebes has crushed Sparta's myth, and it did so with love welded into iron. Thebes' allies treat the band with reverence. Other cities, once hesitant to follow Theban leadership, suddenly lean closer. Ambassadors arrive with offerings hoping to be on the good side of a power that now stands eye to eye with Athens and Sparta. The sacred band marches in festivals, their spears glinting their formation so tight it feels more like a living monument than an army. Crowds cheer, and you can sense the pride swelling. Parents point them out to children saying, "Remember their faces, they made Sparta bleed." Yet admiration is not limited to allies. Rivals watch carefully, their envy hidden behind polite words. Even Athens, with all its pride, must acknowledge the brilliance of what Thebes has done. You overhear an Athenian traveler muttering to his companion, "Strange, isn't it? We honor courage in plays, but Thebes has carved it into reality." You wonder if he realizes he has just confessed Athens' own shortcoming, celebrating in theory what Thebes has lived in flesh. Walking among the sacred band, now you notice how they carry themselves differently. These men are not boastful. They don't swagger or jeer. Their victory speaks for them. Each step seems to say we have proven what others said could not be done. That kind of quiet confidence is heavier than any Spartan shield. Symbols begin to form around them. Shrines are erected, sacrifices made in their honor. The band isn't just military anymore. It's civic, cultural, even spiritual. The Thebans treat them as guardians not only of the city's walls, but of its identity. In their unity, Thebes has found a mirror of its own resilience. You can't help but marvel at the transformation. Only a few years ago, the sacred band was gossip the subject of sneers in symposiums. Now it's legend while still alive. There's something profoundly human about this shift, the way people laugh at the unfamiliar until it proves itself, and then they turn their laughter into applause. You've seen it before in history. In life, the innovation once ridiculed becomes the standard everyone wishes they thought of first. But even as cheers echo through Thebes, you sense a weight beneath the glory. Victory brings honor, yes, but also expectation. Now that the band has shown what devotion can do, they will be measured against that standard again and again. Can they keep it? Will love remain enough to face the storms of Greece's endless rivalries? That question hangs over every celebration, unspoken but heavy. For now, though, you watch them march back into the city, their shields reflecting torchlight, their spears upright like a forest of bronze. The crowd roars, and Thebes basks in the rare warmth of triumph. The sacred band has become more than warriors. They are heroes' symbols, and for some even saints of courage. In a world of shifting alliances and fragile peace, their very existence is a reminder that loyalty can be sharper than steel, and love can be mightier than tradition. The celebration never lasts forever. You stand again on a battlefield, but this time the air feels heavier, the mood darker. The year is 338 BCE, and the place is Cheronea. Across the plain, the rising power of Macedon marches under Philip II and his son, a young Alexander, whose brilliance will soon be known across the world. Thebes, once triumphant, now faces a storm it cannot outrun. And at the heart of it, the sacred band prepares for their final stand. The field looks different from Leuctra. There, Thebes had marched with daring confidence. Here they stand with grim resolve. You watch them tighten their lines pairs, pressing closer together than ever before. They know the stakes. This isn't just another clash of rival city-states. This is Greece itself shifting as Macedon looms with its new style of warfare, its longer sarissas bristling like a field of thorns, its cavalry wheeling with deadly precision. The sacred band faces not only an enemy, but the future itself. Still they do not falter. As Philip's forces advance, the band holds its place on the front line. The clash is immediate and brutal. Sarissa's stab-forward shields smash, and the cries of men echo over the plain. You see the pairs of the band fight as they always have, shoulder to shoulder, spear thrusts timed as if to the beat of a single heart. Where one staggers, the other braces. Where one falters, the other steadies. Even against the relentless Macedonian push, they refuse to break. It becomes clear, though, that the tide has turned. Macedon's innovations grind against Theban valor, like gears against flesh. You notice how the sarissas pierce from farther than Theban spears can reach, how Alexander's cavalry crashes into the flanks with the speed of a storm. Yet still, the sacred band fights on. Their phalanx bends, but never shatters. For every man cut down, another pair fights harder, as if to hold the line not for themselves, but for the memory of those already fallen. Imagine the sight Philip beheld when he finally broke through, not men fleeing, not shields discarded in panic, but 300 Thebans still locked in formation, fallen in place rather than abandoning one another. Ancient sources will later write of Philip himself, standing over their bodies, moved to tears by the devotion he saw. He is said to have declared perish any man who suspects that these men either did or suffered anything unseemly. Think of that, an enemy king, victorious, pausing to honor those he had just destroyed. That tells you everything about what the sacred band became on this field. You walk among the fallen in your mind, and the silence is deafening. The formation is still there, in a way, even in death. Men lie side by side, shields overlapping, as if even the final blow could not sever their bond. This is not a rout. It is a sacrifice. Thebes may have lost Greece, may be swallowed by Macedon's rise, but the sacred band has sealed its legend with blood and devotion that no conquest can erase. For you, it's hard not to feel the weight of it. You think back to the sneers in the Agra, the laughter at the idea of lovers fighting side by side. And here at Chaeronea lies the answer to every joke, men who chose death together rather than dishonor apart. That is why their story survives, while the laughter of their critics has long turned to dust. When the sun sets over the battlefield, you know you are witnessing not just the fall of an army, but the closing of a chapter in Greek history. Yet strangely, it does not feel like defeat. It feels like a vow fulfilled, a final testament, written not in ink, but in the very placement of bodies refusing to scatter. The sacred band, in dying as they lived, have achieved the kind of immortality that even conquerors must respect. You stand in silence at Chaeronea, where the dust has long since settled, but the memory clings to the soil like a scar. What seizes your attention right away is this: while armies vanish and empires crumble, some stories refuse to die. The sacred band is gone, yet their legacy lives on, not through conquest or empire, but through the unshakable devotion that carried them into both victory and death. A stone lion rises on the battlefield, carved in solemn dignity, its gaze fixed across the plain. This monument marks where the band fell, guarding their memory, as fiercely in stone as they once guarded Thebes in flesh. You linger at its base, running your hand over the weathered lines, and it almost feels alive, as if the roar of bronze and the cries of men still echo within its silent mouth. Travelers stop here, even centuries later, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by reverence. It isn't just a grave. It's a statement carved into the earth. Love stood here, and it did not break. You think of how other armies are remembered. Sparta, for its discipline. Athens, for its fleets. Macedon, for its conquests. But the sacred band, they are remembered for something subtler, more enduring. Their legend isn't in the number of cities they captured or the treaties they enforced. It lies in the image of 300 men choosing to fight side by side, their devotion so complete that even in defeat they became immortal. Their love turned into strategy, their bond into a weapon sharper than steel. The Greeks themselves recognized this. Centuries later, writers and poets still spoke of the band as an example of courage beyond ordinary measure. Philosophers pointed to them as proof that devotion could elevate men to heights unreachable by fear or ambition alone. And even their enemies, like Philip, bowed in respect, understanding that what he witnessed at Chaeronea was not simply death. It was loyalty elevated to legend. As you walk away from the Lion Monument, you can't help but think about how rare it is for history to preserve such a story. So many armies have marched across these plains, their names long forgotten, their sacrifices erased. Yet the sacred band endures. Why? Because they remind us of something universal, the power of human bonds. Not politics, not wealth, not brute force, but the simple, profound truth that people will endure the unendurable for the sake of someone they love. And perhaps that's why their story resonates even now. When you strip away the centuries, when you set aside the bronze armor in the dusty battlefields, the heart of it feels familiar. You've seen loyalty like this in smaller ways. Friends who stand up for each other when no one else will, families who endure hardship because they refuse to let go of one another, companions who weather storms together. The sacred band simply magnified what all people know deep down: devotion can make the impossible possible. As the wind stirs around the monument, you pause one last time. Thebes has long faded from its former glory, swallowed by the tides of empire and time. But the sacred band remains etched in memory, an invincible army, not because they never fell, but because even in falling they proved unbreakable. Their story whispers across the centuries, reminding you that history's truest strength isn't always measured in victories, but in the depth of loyalty that survives beyond death itself. History has a way of surprising you, doesn't it? You've just walked through the tale of the sacred band of Thebes, an army built not only on shields and spears, but on devotion so deep it shook Sparta itself. Yet the band was only one chapter in a much larger story. Ancient Greece, for all its myths of gods and battles, also carried quieter tales, moments of tenderness, hidden affections, and bonds that shaped heroes as much as swords did. If you thought love only lingered in poetry, wait until you uncover the untold love stories behind Greece's greatest heroes. The gymnasium was never just about muscles. It was a theater where affection, ambition, and rivalry stripped down under the Athenian sun. You hear the slap of bare feet on dust, the grunt of boys grappling, and the laughter that hides something sharper beneath. Every wall of polished stone echoes with energy. But if you listen closely, you realize these courtyards trained more than warriors. They cultivated bonds that whispered through history, weaving together friendship, mentorship, and something softer that no one dared to carve on stone tablets: but everyone could feel. You walk past a knot of youths, slicking olive oil on their arms, the shine of bronze skin glinting in the light. Older men linger at the edge's eyes, attentive, pretending their interest is only in athletic form. Yet admiration and desire blur together here, and in that blur, entire legacies were born. Think of how we still talk about influential mentors today, where admiration can carry the weight of devotion. The Greeks had already mastered that equation, packaging admiration, mentorship, and attraction into one complicated bundle. Near the wrestling ring, the ground is littered with chalk dust. Two boys, locked together, twisting like a pair of sculpted statues suddenly given breath. Their faces are flushed with effort, their bodies straining in tandem. The crowd cheers, but the noise is tinged with teasing tones, as if everyone knows the contest is only half about winning. Because once the match ends, when oil is rubbed into sore shoulders and hands linger longer than necessary, the line between sport and affection all but disappears. You've seen modern gyms, where people flex harder. Under someone's gaze, the Greeks simply admitted the gaze was part of the game. Further along the colonnade, you notice Socrates himself in the thick of things. His face, famously plain, seems oddly fitting here, because it was never beauty that made him magnetic, but his words. He fires a question at a wide-eyed youth. What is courage? The boy stammers, and the group bursts into laughter. Yet beneath the noise lies something subtler. Socrates was not just teaching logic. He was teaching intimacy disguised as dialogue. The bond between teacher and pupil carried both intellect and devotion. Doesn't that sound familiar today, when a favorite professor or mentor seems larger than life in your memory? Your eyes catch a flash of extravagance by the baths. Alcibiades strolls past, silk draped loosely, head-high trailing admirers. He was the golden boy of Athens, brilliant and reckless, whispering to Socrates one night and commanding fleets the next. Here in the same gymnasia, he trained, laughed, and charmed his way into history. His presence proves how easily affection and admiration could ripple outward into politics, into war, into the gossip that shaped cities. Imagine the murmurs generals sharing tents not only for strategy, but for something harder to define. Doesn't it feel oddly similar to the way celebrity romances dominate headlines now, where public image and private longing merge? The baths themselves thrum with chatter. Steam curls up around marble columns, fogging the air into secrecy. Voices are louder here, freer, bolder. Men joke, splash, argue over politics, and whisper compliments disguised as banter. The warmth loosens restraint, and what is left is possibility. Picture conversations floating across the steam. Who's the finest wrestler? Which youth will grow into a statesman? Whose beauty rivals Apollo's? These weren't just idle remarks. They were negotiations of affection and status. How many alliances, how many loyalties were born, right here, in clouds of heat rather than in marble council halls. On the walls, statues of gods look down, Apollo poised in eternal youth, Hermes frozen mid-step, each carved to remind mortals of perfection. The young men stretching nearby strive toward these ideals, chasing symmetry that no human body can fully achieve. Yet in the chase, admiration becomes longing. Longing becomes story. Isn't it striking how even now, in an age of edited photos and fitness influencers, the same chase for beauty still shapes our connections? The Greeks simply sanctified it, saying the beautiful was close to the divine. By late afternoon, when shadows stretch long over the yard, the mood softens. The noise fades, replaced by poetry. A fragment drifts from a group. Sitting cross-legged, love teaches even the coward to be brave. The words hover in the air like incense, and for a moment the courtyard feels sacred. You realize the gymnasium was never only about preparing for battle. It was about teaching the heart how to endure, how to risk, how to connect. The stones beneath your feet have soaked in centuries of sweat, laughter, whispers, and secrets. From here, these bonds will spill outward into myths sung for ages, into battlefields where loyalty means life or death, into the very stories that made heroes unforgettable. The gymnasium is only the beginning, the first page of a much longer scroll you're about to unroll. The tent flaps stir in the wind, carrying the scent of iron leather and firewood. You step into the dim light and see two figures bent over a map, shadows stretching long across the canvas. Achilles and Patroclus, names whispered through centuries. But here they are, young men at Troy, their bond shaping every decision more than strategy ever could. Achilles, the warrior whose rage could scorch entire armies, leans in close to Patroclus, softer in tone than he ever is with the rest of the Greeks. You notice how the world outside calls them comrades, cousins, or friends. But inside this tent, the language needs no labels. Achilles is fire quick to anger, quick to fight, convinced that glory must be seized with both hands. Patroclus is water calm, measured, steady enough to cool a blaze, yet deep enough to drown in. When Achilles rages at Agamemnon for slighting his honor, Patroclus listens, soothing his fury. His words the only balm strong enough to keep the army from splintering apart. How often do you see someone whose presence contained other storms? The Greeks recognized it to them. Achilles without Patroclus was like a bow without its string, powerful but useless. Think about how their story unfolds in Homer's Iliad. When Achilles withdraws from battle, sulking in his tent, it isn't an entire army's pleading that stirs him. It's Patroclus. The young man dons Achilles' armor, stepping into the role of his beloved friend, not for personal glory, but to save lives. Imagine the courage it took, knowing he wasn't the strongest, yet believing he could carry the weight of Achilles' absence. Doesn't that echo modern stories of people stepping in for those they love, even if the risk is overwhelming? You can hear the clash of bronze when Patroclus enters the battlefield, the Trojans reeling in shock as they think Achilles has returned. For a moment, his bravery shifts the tide, and the Greeks surge forward. But fate is merciless. Hector, Troy's greatest defender, strikes him down, and with that blow, the story of Achilles and Patroclus changes forever. Picture Achilles receiving the news, his roar shaking the air, grief consuming him more completely than any spear ever could. He doesn't just mourn a comrade. He rends his hair, smears ash on his face, and weeps until his chest heaves. The mighty warrior, undone not by arrows, but by love lost. The rage that follows is terrifying. Achilles storms back into battle no longer for honor or fame, but for Patroclus. Every strike of his spear is a cry of vengeance. He chases Hector around Troy's walls, slaughters him, and drags his body behind his chariot. Historians can argue whether this is friendship or romance, but grief of that depth does not spring from simple camaraderie. You've seen how people today react when losing someone they love, how the loss reshapes them, how it fuels decisions that look irrational from the outside, but feel inevitable on the inside. Achilles' vengeance is that feeling multiplied by myth. When you glance back into the tent, you notice the little details: Patroclus' cloak folded neatly, his sandals placed by the bed, the kind of ordinary traces that outlive the extraordinary. Even Homer, cautious with words, never denies the intimacy between them. He lets gestures and grief tell the truth. Later writers like Aeschylus and Plato were even bolder, describing their bond in terms of eros as well as philia. It shows how the Greeks themselves saw no clear line between friendship and love, between affection and loyalty. Why should we centuries later insist on labeling what they left deliberately blurred? In the funeral rites, Achilles holds Patroclus' body close, refusing to let go. He cuts his hair in mourning, an offering as raw as the man himself. He orders a pyre, built high sacrifices, horses, captives, treasures, yet none of it feels sufficient. When the flames rise, Achilles swears he will not rest until he joins Patroclus in the afterlife. This isn't just mourning. It is devotion carried past the limits of life. And indeed, when the Greeks bury them, their ashes are mingled in the same urn so they may remain side by side forever. Doesn't that sound closer to a wedding than a funeral? You step back from the tent, feeling the weight of their story pressing on your chest. Achilles and Patroclus were not symbols carved clean into stone. They were flesh and fire, tenderness and fury, a pair who showed that love, whatever its form, could shape wars and legends alike. And the truth is, every Greek who heard their tale saw a piece of themselves in it, the courage to fight the terror of loss and the longing for a bond that even death could not erase. The palace smells of wine and smoke, and in the center of it all stands Alexander, the boy king, whose ambition stretches farther than any map can hold. Yet when you watch him closely, it's not the generals or philosophers who catch his attention. It's Hephaestion. Taller than most, graceful in posture, Hephaestion moves beside Alexander, like a second shadow, the kind of companion whose presence is so constant you barely notice it until you realize he's always there. Their bond begins in the quiet years of youth, both students under Aristotle, and it grows into something that shapes empires more than armies ever could. Think of the way Alexander looks at him during councils, eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in unspoken understanding. Hephaestion doesn't need to shout across the war table. A single glance communicates what volumes of strategy might say. Isn't it strange how some people don't need words to speak? The Greeks had a word for this kind of devotion, philia blended with eros, a love that was both loyal and intimate, public and private at once. To outsiders, they were generals. To each other, they were halves of the same soul. When you picture Alexander conquering Persia, storming through Babylon, and marching to the ends of the known world, remember that Hephaestion is there beside him, not just as a commander, but as a confidant. Ancient writers described Hephaestion as Alexander's alter ego, his other self. Imagine the weight of that, to be seen not as a companion or subordinate, but as an extension of the king himself. Can you think of anyone in your life whose presence feels like that, so close that your victories don't feel complete unless they're beside you? In the lavish tent, after battle, Alexander and Hephaestion share quiet moments. One story tells of Alexander laying a wreath on Hephaestion's head during a festival, calling him Patroclus, while taking the title of Achilles for himself. It wasn't just playful. It was deliberate, a way of placing their bond within the heroic tradition of Greece's greatest pair. The comparison was bold, almost theatrical, but Alexander never cared much for subtlety. He wanted the world to know his empire was built on more than spears, it was built on love. Not everyone approved. Court whispers followed them, as whispers always do. Political rivals tried to sow tension, hinting that Alexander's devotion to Hephaestion clouded his judgment. But loyalty is a kind of power that enemies underestimate at their peril. When Alexander appointed Hephaestion to lead critical missions, It wasn't favoritism. It was trust, born of years of companionship. Would you risk your empire on someone you didn't fully believe in? Of course not. He knew that Hephaestion's loyalty was stronger than any fortress wall. Then comes the moment no conqueror can fight. In Ecbatana, Hephaestion falls ill and dies suddenly. You see Alexander collapse stripped of the armor of invincibility he wore so convincingly. He refuses food, refuses comfort, and orders temples across the empire to mourn as though a king himself had fallen. He even sends envoys to consult oracles as if trying to argue with fate. Doesn't it tell you everything that the man who subdued kingdoms could not withstand the loss of one person? In his grief, Alexander orders shrines for Hephaestion, demands honors usually reserved for gods. He paces restless like a lion in a cage, unable to accept a world without his companion. Historians say he grew reckless afterward, throwing himself deeper into campaigns as though chasing death in hopes of reunion. And within a year, he too would be gone, leaving an empire split among generals who could never replicate the unity Alexander and Hephaestion embodied. Their story shows that sometimes the strongest empires are held together not by treaties or armies, but by the bond of two people who refuse to see each other as separate. You step back from the Macedonian court, the laughter, the arguments, the echo of hoofbeats fading into silence. What lingers isn't the clamor of conquest, but the quiet truth. Alexander and Hephaestion lived like two sides of the same coin, inseparable in life. And even in death, their names are spoken together. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real victory. Alexander won, not the lands stretched across 3 continents, but the proof that love itself can be an empire. The roar hits you before you even see the arena, cheers rolling like thunder across the fields of Olympia. The games, that great festival of sweat and spectacle, were supposed to honor Zeus, but they also became a stage for affections hidden in plain sight. Victory crowns weren't the only prizes being exchanged. Glances, loyalty, and secret attachments were just as much part of the contests. You squeeze through the crowd, dust stinging your nose, and watch athletes strip down to gleaming skin, their bodies turned into living sculptures. The Greeks claimed it was about celebrating the human form, but you can feel the undertone. It was also about admiration, even desire carried openly under the banner of competition. The wrestlers crash into the sand arms, locked muscles trembling, while spectators shout advice that sounds suspiciously like flirtation. Grip harder. Don't let go. The crowd laughs, but behind the humor lies recognition that these matches weren't only about strength, they were about proving devotion. Rivals often trained together, ate together, and shared lives off the field. Isn't it curious how competition and intimacy often walk hand in hand? Even today, teammates form bonds that blur lines bound not just by goals, but by long hours of sweat and trust. You wander past the track, where runners crouch low, their eyes fixed on the stone markers. The blast of the aulos flute sends them sprinting, dust flying like smoke. The crowd watches breathless, but you can't miss the way certain eyes track only one figure, not the whole pack. Winning meant eternal glory, but being admired, being someone's chosen favorite, that was its own form of triumph. Doesn't it remind you of school sports days when one cheer from the right person meant more than the medal itself? Statues around Olympia prove how admiration was woven into the culture. Victorious athletes weren't just carved for their skill. Their beauty, youth, and charisma became immortal in bronze and marble. One famous story tells of the boxer Diagoras of Rhodes celebrated not only for his victories, but also for the devotion of his sons, who lifted him on their shoulders after winning their own crowns. That image family loyalty pride shows how affection was celebrated publicly, not hidden away. Can you picture the audience erupting in tears, realizing they weren't just seeing victories, but witnessing love in action? In Stoa shaded from the sun, you overhear philosophers arguing, wasn't the bond between trainer and athlete as important as the contest itself? A coach who believed in his pupil not only shaped his body, but also his spirit. Some accused these relationships of favoritism, but to the Greeks, favoritism was precisely the point. To single someone out to invest in them was to declare them worthy of devotion. Isn't that what we still crave today? To be chosen, singled out, told we matter above the rest. The Olympic truce, that sacred pause in wars so athletes could travel safely, also carried a symbolic meaning. Cities could be enemies on the battlefield, but here their champions stood shoulder to shoulder, admired equally by strangers and rivals. And among those rivals, affections bloomed. Think of it, two men who might clash with swords in war could laugh together in the baths after racing bonds slipping between lines of politics. How many whispered friendships, even romances, were sparked under the olive crowns? The banquets after victory made it even clearer. Wine flowed, poets sang, and champions were toasted, not just for their speed or strength, but for their beauty and charm. You imagine a victor, seated proudly laurel crown, tilting, while a friend or admirer pressed close offering honey cakes with a smile that lingered longer than courtesy required. These were the nights where affection wasn't denied, only folded neatly into the celebration of glory. And when dawn broke, athletes left Olympia with more than wreaths. Some carried stories of glances across the track, of whispered encouragement, before a match of shoulders brushed in the baths. The games were supposed to honor the gods, but in truth, they also honored human connection, proving that devotion, whether spoken or silent, was as much part of victory as the olive crown itself. The river glitters under the sun, reeds whispering as the current pulls gently at your ankles. You spot Heracles the lion slayer himself, trudging along the bank with that mix of brute strength and boyish restlessness. Beside him walks Hylas, youthful and radiant, carrying a jug that seems comically small compared to Heracles' massive club. Their companionship feels oddly tender, almost domestic, one the greatest of all Greek heroes, the other a boy whose beauty would be sung about for centuries. Yet it's not the labors or the battles that keep this story alive. It's what happens here by the water's edge. Hylas kneels to fill the jug, the surface rippling as he dips it into the stream. From beneath water, nymphs rise, entranced by his face, his form, his youth. They reach out laughing softly, and before he can shout, they pull him down into the depths. The water swallows him, and silence falls as if the whole river has conspired to keep him. Doesn't it make you think of how fragile admiration can be? How quickly beauty becomes something others try to claim for themselves? The Greeks told this story not as a warning against rivers, but as proof that even heroes could lose the ones they loved in an instant. Heracles returns to the bank, calling Hylas's name, his voice booming through the valley. The mighty warrior who crushed hydras and wrestled lions now trembles with panic. He searches frantically, crashing through reeds, wading into water, but the boy is gone. It's a rare moment where power means nothing. His strength can't fight the current, or wrestle back the nymph's desire. How many times have you seen someone mighty unshakable, undone not by an enemy's sword, but by the sudden absence of a loved one? Heracles becomes every grieving figure in history, pacing the same patch of earth refusing to accept loss. Later, poets describe the scene with sorrow, painting Heracles as wandering endlessly, shouting Hylas' name into the night. Some say he abandoned the Argonauts' expedition altogether, unable to leave the riverside. Imagine that the man whose shoulders carried the world could not take a single step without his companion. Isn't that what devotion looks like, when the absence of one outweighs the weight of everything else? The story of Hylas and Heracles spread across Greek colonies, painted on vases and carved into reliefs. Some artists depicted the abduction as playful, the nymphs smiling as if in jest, while others showed it as tragedy, Heracles' grief etched into stone. Both versions tell the same truth: their bond mattered enough to inspire generations. And the fact that storytellers never agreed whether it was about friendship, mentorship, or romance shows how deeply the Greeks accepted love in all its blurred forms. When you think of Heracles, you often picture labors the lion's pelt, the club, the Herculean strength. But here by the river, another side of him emerges: vulnerable, desperate human. It's easy to forget that even myths leave room for tenderness. Just as modern audiences admire celebrities, not only for their triumphs, but for their heartbreaks, the Greeks cherish this softer tale. Isn't it often the stories of loss, rather than victory, that linger longest? As twilight falls, you can almost hear the splash of water, the echoes of Heracles' voice carried down the current. The river becomes a grave without a marker, a reminder that love sometimes vanishes, not in battle, but in silence. And though centuries pass, each telling of Hylas' disappearance is less about the boy himself and more about what he meant Heracles. Because at the heart of it, the tale isn't about strength or conquest. It's about the raw, universal truth that even heroes weep when love is taken from them. The air shimmers with music, the strings of a lyre trembling beneath skilled fingers. You follow the sound into a grove of laurel trees where Apollo himself sits crowned in sunlight. His voice is warm, playful coaxing, and beside him runs Hyacinthus, a youth whose beauty seems almost dangerous, too perfect for a mortal, too captivating for the god of light to ignore. You can sense that this is no ordinary companionship. It is devotion wrapped in laughter, a god bending his divinity around a boy who shines in his presence. They spend their days together, chasing across meadows, sharing songs, practicing discus throws in wide-open fields. Apollo, god of archery and prophecy, seems strangely human in these moments, grinning when Hyacinthus teases him, bending low to listen when the boy speaks. Isn't it telling how even the most powerful figures soften in the presence of someone they love? You've seen it before. Leaders who roar at crowds, yet whisper gently to one person in private. The Greeks imagined that even their gods were not immune to that contradiction. One afternoon, as the sun blazes high, Apollo and Hyacinthus play at discus. The god hurls the disc across the field, spinning like a slice of golden light. Hyacinthus races after it, eager to impress, eager to catch. But fate twists cruelly. The discus strikes him on the head, and he crumples into the grass. Apollo rushes forward, panic breaking through his calm, lifting the boy in his arms. Imagine the god of healing, weeping his hands, trembling over wounds he cannot close. Doesn't it strike you how love makes even the mighty feel helpless? In his grief, Apollo cries out to the heavens, begging the fates to reverse their decision. But the thread of life is cut, and not even a god can mend it. His tears fall onto the earth, and from the blood of Hyacinthus springs a flower petals, delicate purple, inscribed with the letters AI for alas. The hyacinth blooms as eternal proof of devotion, a symbol of love made visible in nature itself. You can almost picture the Greeks pointing to the blossom each spring, retelling the story as if Apollo's sorrow still lingered in the soil. Writers later debated the accident. Was it truly fate, or did Zephyrus, the jealous west wind, who also loved Hyacinthus, divert the discus in envy? Either way, the message is the same. Love often invites rivalry, and beauty is rarely free from danger. Haven't you noticed how admiration can stir competition even in modern times? Friends, fighting for attention, rivals, lurking in the background, waiting for affection to turn. The Greeks didn't shy away from this. They carved it into myth so no one could forget. In art, Apollo is often shown kneeling over Hyacinthus, his golden hair spilling forward, anguish carved into marble or painted across vases. The god who usually embodies control becomes undone, transformed into a figure of raw, visible grief. And for audiences, that was part of the lesson. Even divinity bends under the weight of love and loss. Isn't that what makes myths so lasting, that they don't just praise perfection, but reveal vulnerability? Later poets would compare Hyacinthus to Achilles' Patroclus and others whose lives ended too soon. His youth became a reminder that beauty often carries fragility, that the brightest flames burn briefest. And Apollo, despite all his power, could only honor him with memory and ritual. Festivals were held in Hyacinthus's name, where hymns rose into the sky, proof that remembrance itself was a form of devotion. As you leave the grove, the wind carries a faint melody, almost like Apollo's voice still singing for the boy he lost. The petals of purple flowers scatter at your feet, and you realize the story is less about death than about the persistence of love. Because every time the hyacinth blooms, it repeats Apollo's promise that what is loved deeply never truly disappears, but reshapes itself into something that can endure the passing of ages. The sky rumbles, and suddenly your eyes are drawn upward. An eagle cuts across the clouds, wings vast claws glinting, carrying something, or rather someone. This is no ordinary flight. The king of the gods himself, Zeus, has reached down from Olympus and stolen a boy from the plains of Troy. His name is Ganymede, a shepherd tending his flocks, and in a heartbeat he becomes immortal, not by choice, but by desire. The Greeks told this story with awe, for if Zeus could fall in love with a mortal, then beauty itself was more powerful than thunderbolts. Picture the boy's simple tunic sandals caked with dust, a crook in hand. He isn't a warrior, philosopher, or king, just a shepherd. And yet, Zeus sees him, decides he must be his, and sends the eagle. The bird swoops low, claws wrap firm, and Ganymede is lifted, screaming, his flock scattering below. Doesn't it make you wonder how often ordinary lives are swept up by forces beyond their control? One moment you're invisible, the next, you're a symbol whispered about in every corner of Greece. In Olympus, Ganymede is crowned cupbearer, replacing Hebe, the goddess of youth. He pours nectar for the gods, his beauty dazzling even among immortals. Vase paintings show him holding a jug hair, flowing smile shy but knowing. Some say he resisted, at first longing for the fields he left behind. Others claim he embraced the honor, stepping into a role that bound him to Zeus forever. Which version feels truer to you? That love is always chosen, or that sometimes it arrives like a storm, leaving no time to decide? The myth stirred debate even in antiquity. Poets praised Zeus's affection, seeing Ganymede as proof that the gods themselves modeled the bonds men sought with youths. Philosophers, however, sometimes grumbled, hinting at arrogance that Zeus took because he could. Isn't that still the question we wrestle with today? When is desire devotion, and when is it power? The Greeks, rather than hiding the tension, preserved both views side by side, teaching that love is rarely simple. Ganymede's story spread far beyond art and poetry. On coins, his figure appeared beside eagles, signaling divine favor for cities that claimed his origin. In statues, he is often portrayed with gentle strength, not passive but poised, as if to remind worshippers that being chosen by Zeus made him more than mortal. Imagine how young men in Greece must have looked at those images. Did they see aspiration warning or both? Meanwhile, down on earth, Ganymede's family mourned. His father, King Tros, wept for his son's disappearance. To soothe him, Zeus sent down a herd of immortal horses and promised that Ganymede would never know death. It was the god's version of an apology. You lose your son, but he gains eternity. Doesn't that sound familiar? Even now, when power offers consolation gifts in place of true repair, it shows how even divine affection carried costs, measured not only in joy, but in absence. Yet for all its complexities, the tale endured as a story of devotion. Zeus, who could wield storms, chose to honor beauty above all. And Ganymede, plucked from anonymity, became eternal, a constellation shining in the night sky. Each time the stars wheel above you, his form still glimmers, locked in the heavens, cup raised as though still serving nectar. You can almost feel the paradox, the boy who lost his home yet gained immortality, the god who bent the rules of Olympus for love. You step away from the mountain slopes, the eagle's cry still echoing in your ears. What lingers is not the violence of the abduction, but the strange tenderness that followed a story that forced the Greeks to admit what they already knew, that love, in all its messy forms, could humble even the greatest of gods. The sea breeze carries you toward an island draped in song. You hear a voice before you see its source, soft, deliberate, threaded with longing. On the cliffs of Lesbos stands Sappho, her lyre resting against her shoulder, her words tumbling out like waves. She doesn't sing of battles or kings. She sings of glances, of whispered touches, of the way a heartbeat quickens when beauty enters the room. And unlike most poets of Greece, she speaks as a woman, as a lover, as someone unafraid to weave desire into verse. You sit among her circle of companions, women, who lean close to catch every syllable. They aren't soldiers, they aren't generals, yet their bonds feel no less powerful. Sappho names them in her poems: Anactoria, Athis Gongola, real people immortalized not by conquest, but by affection. Doesn't it strike you how rare that is even today, for love stories between women to survive the silence of centuries? Yet here she is, her fragments carved into papyrus, echoing across millennia. Her words don't hide behind riddles. He seems to me equal to the gods she begins in one famous poem describing not Zeus or Apollo, but the man who sits across from her beloved, stealing her attention. Her honesty is disarming. She admits her tongue breaks. Her ears buzz, her skin burns when desire overtakes her. How many listeners, ancient or modern, have felt the same, but lacked the courage to say it aloud? Isn't that the gift of poetry, to name what everyone feels, but few dare confess? Later generations struggled with her legacy. Some praised her as the 10th muse, while others squirmed at her openness, twisting her life into myths to explain away her love. One legend claimed she leapt from a cliff for a man named Phaon, as if her devotion to women needed balancing with a tragic heterosexual ending. But the truth is simpler. Her poetry leaves no doubt. She loved women, she celebrated them, and she refused to apologize for it. Doesn't it remind you of how societies even today try to rewrite lives that don't fit the script? The setting amplifies her defiance. Lesbos, with its olive groves and azure waters, became a haven where her school of poetry thrived. Imagine evenings where women gathered, reciting verses, exchanging garlands, weaving affection into ritual. It wasn't rebellion in the loud sense. It was persistence, choosing to make their love visible in an age that often left such stories in the shadows. That persistence is why her name survives, why we still call love between women sapphic. Her influence rippled beyond her island. Plato admired her Roman poets, borrowed from her Renaissance scholars, copied her verses. Each era tried to frame her through its own lens, yet the core of her voice remained. Love is sacred. Desire is human beauty, is worth worshiping. Can you imagine how many secret readers centuries later clung to her words as proof they weren't alone? You glance at the women beside her, laughing, passing cups of wine, their faces glowing in lamplight. These aren't the battles sung by Homer, but they are victories of another kind. The triumph of truth over silence, the celebration of bonds that refuse to be erased. And as Sappho strums her lyre again, her song becomes less about the island and more about all of us, every listener who ever felt desire sharpen into verse. When the night deepens, the stars spread wide above Lesbos, and you realize her words are like those constellations, fragments of light scattered across darkness, still visible after thousands of years. You rise carrying her voice with you, knowing it will echo long after the fires die and the lyre strings fall silent. Dust rises as hooves strike the ground, and in the middle of it all stride two figures who seem less like mortals and more like a matched set of legends. Theseus, the slayer of the Minotaur, walks tall and sure, while at his side is Pirate House King of the Lapiths, reckless grin, flashing as if danger were a game. They meet not as strangers, but as challengers. Pirate House once daring to steal Theseus's cattle just to test the hero's courage. Instead of clashing to the death, they stare each other down and astonishingly laugh. From that laugh begins a bond so wild that it would lead them into schemes even the gods would call outrageous. Together, they fought at Pirate House's wedding, where centaurs drunk on wine tried to abduct the brides. Side by side, sword against hoof and fury, they carved through the chaos, saving the feast from ruin. Doesn't it strike you how often bonds are sealed in the fire of conflict? One moment your rivals, the next, your brothers, or perhaps something deeper forged in blood and loyalty. In Greek eyes, the spectacle of two men standing together against impossible odds was not just heroism, it was devotion made visible. Their adventures didn't stop there. With the arrogance of youth and glory behind them, they made a pact to marry daughters of Zeus himself. Theseus set his eyes on Helen, still a girl whom he carried off and hid until she came of age. Pirate House, not to be outdone, declared he would claim Persephone, queen of the underworld. Can you imagine the audacity, two mortals plotting to court women who belonged to gods, as if love and loyalty gave them the right to challenge the cosmos? It sounds reckless, and it was, but it also reveals how their bond fed each other's daring. They descended into Hades together, cloaked in boldness, hearts racing, but the underworld does not take kindly to thieves. Hades welcomed them politely, then set a trap. He invited them to sit on a rock, and the moment they did, the stone clamped tight, binding them there. Time stretched on. Some say they were trapped for years, their bodies withering yet still together side by side. Isn't it strange how even punishment reflects devotion bound by fate, as they had been bound by choice? Eventually, Heracles on his own labors stumbled upon them. He pulled Theseus free, straining with all his strength. But when he tried to rescue Pirithous, the earth shook violently, forbidding it. Pirithous remained behind, locked forever in Hades, while Theseus walked again under the sun. For the Greeks, this ending carried a lesson. Some bonds are so intense they defy the natural order, and the gods themselves intervene to keep balance. Yet the memory of their loyalty lived on their names, paired in stories as surely as Achilles and Patroclus. You picture Theseus, after the rescue, standing under the sky, breathing deeply, but glancing at the empty space beside him. How heavy must freedom feel when the one who shared your daring is gone. Heroes often win battles, but they rarely escape grief. Isn't it true even today, when we achieve something great, but immediately wish the one person we shared it with were still there to see it? The myth of Theseus and Pirithous became a favorite among storytellers, not because of its success, but because of its audacity. It showed how far devotion could push two men, how love, whether named friendship, loyalty, or romance, could make them believe nothing was out of reach. And though they failed spectacularly, their failure was remembered longer than many victories. As you step away from the tale, you can almost hear their laughter echoing reckless and unashamed, as if even eternity couldn't silence it. Two heroes daring the impossible, bound by a bond too strong to be explained away, that's what made them unforgettable. Even death refuses to loosen its grip when it comes to Achilles, whose devotion to Patroclus and demand upon his son Neoptolemus turned grief into something eternal. On the beaches of Troy, where smoke still rises from the ruins, whispers spread that the fallen warrior does not rest quietly in his barrow. His spirit is restless, pacing the shore, calling out, demanding honor. For the Greeks, this wasn't just a ghost story. It was proof that the strongest bonds stretch beyond life, shaping the choices of the living. You see Neoptolemus, young and untested, standing awkwardly among hardened soldiers. His lineage is both blessing and curse. He carries Achilles' name, Achilles' blood, and therefore the unbearable weight of expectation. But the pressure isn't only from men around him. It is said his father's shade appears in dreams, insisting on devotion, commanding loyalty. Have you ever felt the shadow of expectation so heavy it seemed like someone was watching you, even from beyond the grave? For Neoptolemus, that shadow was literal. The stories tell that after Troy fell, Achilles' ghost demanded a sacrifice. He wanted Polyxena, the Trojan princess, offered at his tomb. Some call it cruelty, others call it love, distorted into possession, an insistence that memory be honored, not with words, but with blood. Neoptolemus, torn between pity and duty, carried out the command. It is a scene painted with tragedy. A boy proving loyalty to a father he barely knew, bending to a spirit that would not be silenced. Doesn't it raise the question, how much of what we do is for ourselves? And how much is to satisfy the voices of those who came before us? Euripides captured this tension in Hecuba, where the act becomes not just sacrifice, but a performance of obligation. The Greeks in the audience would have recognized the weight families binding descendants to traditions demanding obedience across generations. It is unsettling, yes, but also deeply human. Because who among us hasn't felt caught between compassion and duty, between our own choices and what others expect us to carry? Later myths tried to soften the story. They imagined that in the afterlife on the White Isle, Achilles welcomed Neoptolemus with pride. Father and son, estranged in life, reunited in death, walking side by side as heroes. To listeners, it must have offered a bittersweet comfort, the idea that loyalty, no matter how heavy, would eventually lead to reunion. Isn't that why so many cultures imagine an afterlife not just to explain death, but to assure us that love and devotion will one day be restored? Achilles' ghostly presence reframed how the Greeks thought of love and obligation. With Patroclus, love was tender, personal, shattering in grief. With Neoptolemus, it became generational, a thread binding past to present life to death. For the Greeks, these weren't contradictions. Love could be both nurturing and demanding both solace and burden. The line between devotion and possession blurred, and in that blur lay its enduring power. You stand now at the barrow of Achilles, wind whipping across the plain waves, slapping against the shore. The mound rises high, less a grave than a monument to the weight of memory. Every chant, every offering left here speaks of the same truth: the dead continue to command and the living continue to answer. And as you look closer, you realize the tale of Achilles and Neoptolemus is not about death at all, but about the way love, whether fierce, gentle, or relentless, insists on shaping the world even after breath has fled. The long voyage home is never simple, and Odysseus, king of Ithaca, knows this more than anyone. You find him not on the battlefield now, but in the twilight of a campfire, surrounded by comrades who whisper, laugh, and sometimes mutter things that complicate the tidy tale of the faithful husband. The Odyssey paints him as bound to Penelope, but other voices in Greece hinted at affections that blurred the edges of his reputation. Isn't it curious how every polished legend has shadows trailing just behind it? You hear men talk of Circe and Calypso, the enchantresses who detained him, but what about the bonds among sailors themselves? Months at sea, storms crashing, men depending on one another, not just for survival, but for sanity. Doesn't it make sense that devotion would grow there too? In a world where longing had no clear categories, closeness could turn into something stronger. Rival bards even whispered that Odysseus's story was tidied up, later smoothed into respectability so audiences wouldn't blush. But under the surface, rumors remained bonds with certain comrades that crossed from loyalty into intimacy. When you picture the cramped decks of a trireme, the smell of salt thick in the air, the constant groan of wood against waves, you realize isolation forges connections the world on shore can't imagine. A hand steadying yours in the dark, a laugh breaking despair, a shared glance when the sea threatens to swallow the ship. These moments carry more weight than oaths made in royal halls. Can't you think of times in your own life when the smallest gesture from a companion meant more than speeches from leaders? Ancient gossip about Odysseus often focused on his rivals too. Ajax, who competed with him for Achilles' armor, was said to resent not only Odysseus's cunning, but the way he drew others toward him. His charisma, sharp tongue and wit, had a magnetism that people couldn't ignore. The suspicion was always the same: was it only admiration? Or was there something warmer beneath? Greek audiences loved these ambiguities. They didn't demand that their heroes fit neatly into categories. You follow the tale into Sicily, where Odysseus outwits Polyphemus the Cyclops. His men, cling to one another under sheep's bellies. As they escape breath, held hearts pounding. Imagine the bond forged in that moment, danger pressing so close you can feel each other's pulse. Later poets hinted that Odysseus's cleverness wasn't his only weapon. It was the loyalty he inspired loyalty that might have been colored with affection as much as trust. Doesn't that explain why even when his schemes endangered them, his men followed him anyway? When he finally reaches Ithaca, the story insists on Penelope, the loom, the suitors, the reunion. But some versions tell of quiet reunions, never written into Homer's lines, meetings with old companions, embraces held longer than mere courtesy. In vase paintings, Odysseus is sometimes shown not with his wife, but with his crew banquets, where their closeness is drawn in subtle gestures. To us, it may look like speculation, but to the Greeks, those details mattered. They knew a hero could love in more ways than one. What lingers most is not the fidelity or the trickery, but the unspoken truth that Odysseus's story, like every human story, was messy. His rivals accused, his comrades whispered, and his legend walked a line between ideal husband and complicated man. And perhaps that's why his tale endured, not because it was flawless, but because it reflected how love and loyalty are never simple, never clean, always tangled in rumor and reality. You leave Odysseus by the firelight shadows flickering across his face, and you realize that beneath the polished epic lies another version, a hero whose bonds were as layered as his schemes, whose heart was pulled in more directions than poets dared to admit. The banquet hall glows with lamplight garlands drooping from columns and cushions scattered across the floor. You recline on one of them, shoulder to shoulder, with men who laugh, sip wine, and speak as though every word will outlive them. This is Plato's Symposium, that famous night where love itself becomes the topic, and suddenly the heroes of Greece are not swinging swords, but wielding ideas sharper than any blade. The setting feels alive, with the mix of perfume, roasted meats, and the sound of lyres, yet what truly fills the air is argument. One by one, voices rise to praise Eros, the god of love. Phaedrus begins insisting that love is the greatest motivator, stronger even than fear of death. He points to the legends of Achilles and Patroclus, to Alcestis, who gave her life for Admetus, insisting that no one would risk so much without devotion burning at their core. As he speaks, you notice nods around the room, for everyone has seen the truth of it. People can be compelled by duty, by honor, by pride, but love makes them reckless in a way nothing else can. Haven't you seen the same? When someone abandons logic for the sake of the person they cannot bear to lose. Then Pausanias raises his cup, smiling, with the confidence of someone who enjoys stirring discomfort. He splits love into two kinds, common and heavenly. Common, he says, is the love that seeks only pleasure. Heavenly, however, is the love that binds souls, that shapes character, that inspires virtue. The room hums with approval and debate, for the Greeks were never afraid to discuss openly what others would only whisper. Doesn't it sound familiar, the way we still argue about what love really is? Lust, devotion, or something beyond either? Eryximachus, a physician, follows, stretching the idea wider, claiming love exists not only between people, but across the universe. Harmony between elements, balance in music, health in the body. It sounds lofty, perhaps even pompous, but in the haze of wine, his words glitter. Aristophanes, the comic poet, then takes his turn, and the mood shifts. He spins the story of humans once whole split apart by the gods, forever searching for their missing halves. The laughter is loud, but you can feel the undercurrent of recognition. Who hasn't felt incomplete, as though one part of their soul waits in someone else? When Socrates finally speaks, the room stills. He repeats the teachings of Diotima, a priestess who told him love was a ladder from desire for one body to appreciation of all beauty, from affection for souls, pursuit of wisdom, until at last love becomes a vision of the divine itself. His voice is calm, almost teasing, but the effect is electric. The men lean forward, realizing that love in this vision is not weakness, but the very engine that drives humans toward immortality. Doesn't that flip the usual tale of heroes on its head, suggesting that what makes them great is not war, but love? Outside, the night deepens. Torches flicker. Cups are refilled, and Alcibiades suddenly stumbles in dramatic praising. Socrates, not for looks, but for the strange, irresistible pull of his mind. He confesses devotion as shamelessly as if it were another toast. Some chuckle, some shake their heads, but none deny the truth, even in Athens, where conquest and politics defined reputations, intimacy and admiration shaped destinies just as much. You lean back, eyes heavy from wine, and realize this night is more than talk. It is a map of Greek thought, proving that love was not just a private feeling, but a force they believed could shape nations, philosophies, even the cosmos itself. And as the laughter fades and the lyre's strings hum one last note, you sense why the symposium survived, because every age asks the same question: what is love really for? And every age, like this banquet, finds a dozen different answers. The morning air in Athens smells faintly of olive groves and dust, but you are not walking to the agora or the battlefield. You are wandering into a garden where ideas grow louder than the cicadas. Here, philosophers linger with their pupils, and the line between teaching and affection is drawn with a hand too light to last. You see Socrates' bare feet pressing into the earth, surrounded by young men who lean forward, their faces lit with curiosity and something warmer. For the Greeks, the pursuit of wisdom was never purely abstract. It was embodied in relationships that tied intellect to intimacy. You pause near a shaded stoa, hearing Socrates question a boy about justice. His tone is playful, but his eyes linger sharp and gentle all at once. The Greeks had a word for this blend: paideia, the shaping of character through teaching, and in it, affection played a central role. Teachers did not only shape minds, they formed souls, and bonds of devotion often blossomed in the process. Isn't it striking how even now we talk about mentors, not in dry terms, but with warmth, as if the gratitude for knowledge always carries a spark of love? Plato himself admitted as much. His dialogues are peppered with moments where philosophy feels less like debate and more like courtship. In the Phaedrus, he describes the soul as a charioteer, pulled by two horses, one noble, one unruly, struggling to steer toward truth. The allegory is dazzling, but what gives it weight is the scene of a lover and beloved walking together, words weaving philosophy and affection into the same thread. Don't you find it fascinating how lessons land deeper when they are tied to the heart as well as the mind? Other philosophers took their turns. Aristotle, more practical, tutored Alexander the Great and built a bond that shaped the world itself. The young king listened not just because Aristotle was wise, but because their connection gave weight to every lesson. When Alexander later marched across Persia, was it only strategy guiding him? Or was it the memory of conversations under the trees in Macedon with a teacher who stirred both intellect and admiration? Not every bond was celebrated without criticism. Some Athenians frowned at the intensity of these relationships, whispering about impropriety. Yet the culture never erased them. It debated them openly. The tension between mentorship and desire between guidance and affection was not hidden, but examined. Isn't that a lesson in itself, that societies grow stronger when they admit complexity instead of pretending it doesn't exist? In art, you notice the subtle nods, vases showing philosophers with pupils, gestures gentle but lingering eyes, drawn in lines that suggest something beyond logic. These images were not scandal. They were acknowledgement. They told audiences that philosophy was not lived in books, but in bonds and conversations that shaped both thought and feeling. And perhaps that's why Greek philosophy still resonates, because it was never just cold reasoning, but something alive, relational, embodied. As you stroll through the garden, cicadas buzzing louder, you realize the discussions are less about answers than about presence. A teacher's voice, a student's laugh, the rhythm of dialogue carried like music. The Greeks believed that truth itself was pursued not alone, but together in affection and trust, sometimes even in longing. And maybe that is why their ideas endure, not because they were carved into marble, but because they were whispered between hearts that beat a little faster in each other's company. The marble floors of Alexandria's palace gleam under torchlight, and you find yourself surrounded by men who wear crowns heavier than helmets. These are not mythic heroes, but kings, rulers of the Hellenistic age, and yet their courts thrum with stories of devotion every bit as daring as Achilles and Patroclus. You notice quickly that power here is not just measured in armies or treasuries, it is also measured in the quiet influence of companions who share beds, counsels, and destinies with their rulers. Look first at Ptolemy II of Egypt, who adored his friend Socrates, the poet, even as Socrates mocked him in verse. The affection was so obvious that courtiers whispered about favoritism, about how poetry could sway policy. Then there was Demetrius Poliorcetes, who openly paraded his bond with companions, scandalizing rivals but inspiring loyalty among his troops. Doesn't it remind you of how even modern leaders are scrutinized not only for their decisions, but for who stands at their side shaping them in subtle ways? Perhaps the most famous example is Alexander's successors. Though Hephaestion was gone, his model lingered, and kings across the Hellenistic world imitated the closeness of conqueror and companion. Some historians describe Antiochus III mourning deeply for a beloved named Stratonice, collapsing the boundary between politics and intimacy. These tales reveal how devotion could tilt thrones, bend policies, even start wars. After all, when a ruler's heart is claimed, the ripple touches everyone. Haven't we seen this in history? Leaders undone not by enemies, but by those they couldn't live without. Banquets in these courts were grander than anything Athens ever imagined. Reclining couches lined with embroidered cushions, golden cups, brimming with wine and music weaving through the hall. Yet beneath the spectacle, loyalties played out in glances and who was seated closest to the king, in whose name was toasted first. Imagine being a courtier, watching, realizing that one favored smile could decide your fortune or ruin. Isn't it striking how intimacy, even unspoken, could be more dangerous than an army? The statues tell the same story. Some kings commissioned images of themselves alongside companions carved not just as rulers, but as pairs echoing the heroic couples of old. In these depictions, devotion wasn't hidden, it was immortalized. Citizens walking past such statues didn't just see monarchy, they saw affection enshrined as part of statecraft. It was a reminder that the private heart and the public throne were inseparable. Not everyone approved. Critics claimed rulers who indulged in such bonds grew weak, distracted, open to manipulation. But their empires tell another tale. Affection often bred loyalty, and loyalty kept kingdoms intact. Isn't it easier to trust a companion bound by love than a mercenary bound only by coin? The Greeks and their successors seemed to think so, and they wagered entire dynasties on it. You wander through the echoing corridors, hearing laughter and music fading into the night. It dawns on you that these stories of kings and companions aren't diversions. They're continuations of the same pattern woven since the days of Homer. Love, loyalty, and intimacy were never separate from power. They were the hidden engines driving it forward. And as the Hellenistic kingdoms stretched across lands once held by Persia and Egypt, they carried with them not only Greek weapons and temples, but also Greek ideas of devotion, an inheritance as enduring as any marble column. The marble of Greece fades beneath your feet, and suddenly the roads stretch forward into Rome, into centuries beyond, where echoes of those ancient loves refuse to die. You notice how Roman poets, Virgil, Ovid, Catullus, borrowed freely from Greek tales, reshaping them for new audiences, but keeping the same heartbeat. Achilles and Patroclus became models for Roman soldiers' loyalty, while Zeus and Ganymede appeared in mosaics and statues as Jupiter and his chosen cupbearer. It is as if Greece had planted seeds and Rome harvested them, weaving intimacy into its own imperial tapestry. In Roman villas, frescoes displayed stories of Apollo and Hyacinthus, of Heracles and Hylas, not as curiosities, but as cultural touchstones. Guests would sip wine, gaze at the painted walls, and recognize instantly the message love and devotion, no matter how controversial, had the power to inspire beauty and memory. Doesn't it strike you that art often preserves truths long after society tries to silence them? These images outlived empires, whispering to anyone willing to look closely. As Christianity rose, the stories changed shape again. Church fathers debated them sometimes, condemning, sometimes allegorizing, yet never fully erasing them. Achilles, mourning Patroclus; Alexander, honoring Hephaestion; Sappho, singing on Lesbos, all were reframed as moral lessons. Yet the intimacy at their core remained impossible to wash away. Even in disapproval, the past was acknowledged. Isn't that what happens whenever people try to rewrite history? The original story lingers stubborn as a shadow. Centuries later in the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered Plato's Symposium, dusting off manuscripts and translating them into languages that could once again circulate in candlelit halls. Painters like Raphael filled canvases with imagery of Ganymede. Ascending poets invoked Sappho's name with reverence, and suddenly the old stories pulsed with new life. Across Europe, whispers grew into movements, and love, long hidden in shadows, began to claim visibility again. Doesn't it remind you of how old songs return in new generations, carrying meanings their composers never imagined? By the time modernity arrived, the names of these Greek heroes had become symbols. Writers spoke of Achilles' heel, but also of Achilles and Patroclus as proof of love beyond friendship. Sappho's fragments, fragile and incomplete, inspired whole movements centuries after her death. Even Ganymede's ascent became a metaphor for youth beauty and divine favor. These were no longer just myths. They were cultural code signals passed from age to age. You step now into the present, and you realize that the untold love stories of ancient Greek heroes never truly vanished. They resurfaced whenever people needed them most, when soldiers sought courage, when poets sought words, when lovers sought proof that their bonds were not new, but ancient, honored divine. Every age added its own gloss, but the essence remained the same. Love, in all its forms, is inseparable from what makes us human. As the journey closes, you look back over the gymnasia, the battlefields, the rivers, the banquets, the underworld, the palaces. You have walked beside gods and mortals, kings and poets, watching how affection, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce,